Korea. Okay, so please remember this is rather very sketchy, very rough kind of socio-economic surroundings in East Asia, so to speak. Mostly before 20th century and toward in the middle of the 20th century. Okay. So let me go to 이거였지. lecture 1이었지. continue, 그지? It's continued to lecture 1, but it is up to yeah. Actually, this part, an economic history of an economic history of modern China. Before that, let me briefly go back to the setting, historical setting in the Third World. As I briefly outlined in my last lecture, the Third World sort of followed up toward the modernization movement in the West. You know, for example, first modernization started from the European continent and also, of course, to America. And then it also started even in the Soviet Union or in the old Russia and so forth, but somewhat belatedly in Asia, you know. And this Third World movement toward modernization set the tone to some extent. And we will particularly take a look at today briefly about China, you know, which is the main country in the East. And then we will move very briefly into the modernization case in Japan. And then finally coming back to the case of Korean Peninsula. Of course, we will have separately China session. I think after several weeks, we will begin to look at China in depth. China session. At the same time, we will look at Japanese modernization separately. So this is a kind of preview before we get into China and Japan separately. We are going to just very briefly sketch the modernization effort in modern China. Now, in case of China, '10th century to 14th century, the traditional Chinese economy outperformed European economies and other counterparts. They enjoyed world's highest GDP per capita. Can you believe it? In other words, China as a single kind of modern country was a kind of superpower. In the 10th and 14th century, during roughly about 400 years, they dominated in terms of kind of development. But at the onset of the 14th century, its lead began to decrease. Isn't it interesting? While Europe's GDP rose due to medieval industrial revolution, In other words, Europe's GDP, GDP is economic power, production, and income. All of a sudden, due to industrial revolution, and we call this industrial revolution, we have a specific name of it. That is medieval industrial revolution. In other words, this industrial revolution has preceded main industrial revolution during 19th century, late 19th century in Europe. That's in British economy particularly, main industrial revolution. Before that, prior to that, at the onset of 14th century in Europe, all of a sudden GDP per person, per capita income rose due to medieval industrial revolution. What kind of medieval industrial revolution was that? Well, European farming sector started to introduce some machinization. In other words, machines. And therefore, their powerful introduction of machines on farming increased per capita output on the farm. And we call that period as medieval industrial revolution. So from 14th to 18th century, China's per capita income remained very stagnant. Even though population and GDP continued to grow and remained the largest in the world, but per capita income remained very stagnant because of the relatively very large population increase. So by 1950, the relative decline is so great that China's per capita income was estimated to be roughly 1/10 of European counterparts. So by 1950, China became one of the poorest country group behind that of India. So that's a kind of very sketchy Chinese economic development and modernization from 10th century to 20th century. So one of the question is, if China by 1950 was one of the poorest nation, what happened to China between 1950 to 1978? Of course, as you know, China was consolidated by power, socialist regime under Mao, and they tried to consolidate power, and they tried to launch economic development programs. And what happened after 1979 until 2009? Very high economic growth was achieved by China, and dominant became one of the dominant economies. In 2008, world's largest exporter, replacing Germany, they became. In 2010, China replaced Japan as the second largest economy in terms of magnitude of GDP, set to overtake US in the near future. They say that by 2030 or so, 2030 or 2040, US could be overtaken by China. China has the world's largest foreign exchange reserves and second largest recipient of foreign direct investment, next to United States. As economist North pointed out, a country's development path is dependent on its past, value system, and institutions. So probably China's development path will be dependent on its past, its value system, and its institutions. So China, in the last 200 years, we will learn from part 1 of our text that China's pre-modern growth economy, and why not industrial revolution in 14th century China? Why not medieval industrial revolution did not occur in China during the 14th century? And why 18th century England's industrial revolution occurred, but not in China? So it's kind of mystery. Population dynamics of traditional China, we will take a look at, and agriculture, which is the core sector in Chinese economy, we will take a detailed look. And then traditional handicraft industry and urbanization, we will also take a look at. Trade, traditional social structure, why China failed to industrialize earlier despite its relatively advanced economic and technological development and its sophisticated social and political institutions. So China trailed behind Japan in modernization and industrialization. Why China failed relative to Japan to industrialize itself earlier? That's the key question we will take a look at. China's transition to modern economic growth after its forced opening for trade by the West in the mid-19th century. We will learn like very turbulent period in Chinese history, particularly, the opening of China, Chinese port, and things like that. And then also some of the Chinese part was colonialized to some extent. So we will take a look at this turbulent history of modern China. Why Japan, not China, first non-European country to industrialize successfully? Both Japan and China had a very low initial per capita income. Both had agrarian economies with high man-land ratio and intensive farming method. The same irrigation technology from China spread to Japan. Writing, paper making, and Confucian value system was shared. Here, let me briefly mention about irrigation, and particularly intensive farming method. Intensive farming method means with a piece of land, more people are working on farming. So it is more very labor intensive farming method. That's the method we call intensive farming method, okay? So for example, in both China and Japan, the given piece of land to farmer was relatively very small, particularly in China, in Japan, and also in Korea. Therefore, they must have worked very hard to produce necessary output. So we call that kind of farming method intensive farming method. The opposite wording could be extensive farming method. Extensive means the farming method which has a very vast piece of land, and so that relatively not many people are working on the farm, but you have to rely on sort of a vast piece of land to cultivate your land and to make farming. So this extensive farming method is just opposite word of intensive farming method. Chinese society relatively more advanced. Essentially, it was a kind of capitalist society with free peasantry and private property rights. Relatively high inter and intra-class mobility. Inter-class mobility is from one class to another, from lower class to upward class mobility, right? Higher class mobility. From lower class to higher class mobility, we call interclass mobility. Intra-class mobility is within, let's say, lower class of the society. There could be in between within the class mobility. So poorest class to next second poorest class. There could be intra-class mobility within one class. We call that as within class mobility, intra-class mobility, with an incentive system based on achievement and individual merit. That was the characteristic of China. Japan, rather than China, had a very swift and smooth transition to modern economic growth after Meiji Restoration. We are talking about 1868 through 1885, roughly about 20 years. Japan moved very swiftly, very smoothly into the transition to modern economic growth. We call this period as post-Meiji Restoration. Restoration is kind of reform-minded work effort. In other words, restoration is from the, for example, kingdom type, old-fashioned dynasty. Suppose political system becomes more republican type, more democracy, let's say more transparent political system. That transformation we call restoration, yushin. Okay. During that process, Japan was moving ahead very swiftly. Korea opened port after Kanghwa Treaty. Kanghwa is west of Seoul port area. We call Kanghwa Island. And in that island, Kanghwa Treaty was made between Korea and Japan. And it was almost forced treaty imposed by Japan. Japan by 1876 gained a kind of power in this area. And Japan demanded Korea to open its port under the agreement of Kanghwa Treaty. Prior to that, Korea was attacked by French kind of vessel, French ship, and also Korea was approached by United States. US fleet and French fleet tried to open up Korean port, but Koreans debated whether or not opening the port is appropriate at the time before 1876. And they rejected both French venture and US venture. But they succumbed to Kanghwa Treaty Japanese venture. So finally, this Kanghwa Treaty was the first port opening measure and treaty. And it was imposed by Japan. Remember, 1876 is in the middle of this Japan's restoration, post-Meiji Restoration period. So Japan's power gathered, mobilized after Meiji Restoration. ultimately was the source of imposing Ganghwa Treaty on port opening by Koreans. You see, this is only 10 years after Meiji Restoration. So after Meiji Restoration within Japan, a group of bureaucrats and military personnel gained the political power. And they put emperor, eliminating all little kingdoms, all little kings prior to Meiji Restoration. And they put emperor as a symbol of nation. And then they governed the political system, both bureaucrats and military people. So China's transition was very slow and painful. On the other hand, it is very contrasting transition to Japan, which has moved very swiftly, very smooth transition to modern economic growth after Meiji Restoration. But China's transition was very slow and painful. It started from the famous Opium War in 1842, but it was not until 1949 in Communist China. I want you to read about Opium War ahead of time, and there are many. There you can Google search and you can look up some history book. What was Opium War? Opium War was basically China was forced to open their port and trade opium. And at that period, 1842, Chinese kingdom, the king of China, strongly rejected trading opium because opium is no good for their people. But, China could sell a lot of tea and a lot of, for example, textile to Europe. But Europe as a continent could not have enough products to sell China. You know, Europeans love the Chinese, porcelain, textile, like silky textile, Chinese tea. Everything from China was very fashionable to the Europeans. But Europeans didn't have anything to sell to China. So this Opium War was broken out in 1842, forcing China to open their port and to allow for opium trading between England and China. And at any rate, but it was not until 1949 in communist China and Chinese economy took it off. All of a sudden, jumped off. Hence, China's transition lasted for more than 100 years. So, roughly between Opium War and when China began to develop itself, like going through the stage of takeoff in early 1950, how many years has been spent? Almost 1 century, 100 years has been spent. While Japan made a swift and smooth transition to modernization, China lagged behind Japan in the form of very chaotic domestic politics. Why? Because China was divided into two groups. Chiang Kai-shek led, Kuomintang, Kuomintang, National Party group, and also Mao Zedong led sort of Communist Party. So internal war within China blocked China from industrialization and from modernization. So the question is, why so slow China's transition? And foreign trade and investment after 1942 and European intrusion shows you very sort of comparative picture. That is, for example, this is battles between shogunal and the Choshu forces in the second Choshu expedition. This shows a part of economic history of modern China, fighting between shogunal is traditional forces and Choshu forces, modern army and navy, and they were fighting against each other big, you know, we call that a second Choshu expedition. Turbulent period. Edo shogunate, in other words, prior to, before Meiji Restoration, Tokugawa period. The last shogun's picture is shown here, Tokugawa Yoshinobu. So after him, emperor was put up by political powers, power group, like bureaucrats and military men, and therefore this Tokugawa period was ending, for example. Takayoshi and Okubo Toshimichi, the architects of prefectural system, they are known to have a kind of divided system. In other words, rather than national unification and governance, they wanted to have local governments in Japan to work on governorship. In other words, local government became more important in their politics. That's also another economic history of modern China. This is a promulgation of the Meiji Constitution. You see, all these costumes you can see are very modern. It looks like almost like Russian costumes, you know, Russian period during Tsar period, before Russia's revolution period. What is that? Imperial Russian period. Looks like costumes, looks like Russian costumes, very modern looking. It's not like traditional Japanese costumes. Okay, that's kind of Meiji Constitution declaration event. And this is a kind of one of my associates, research associates, Professor Fukao and his group of Japanese Hitotsubashi University compiled some old data. And according to their data, comparison of our current price PPP per capita GDP with medicine's back projected estimate in 1990 US dollars. First, in 1990 US dollars means this estimate is in real terms, real dollars. So have taken care of inflation effect. So it is real dollars. What is PPP? Some of the non-economics major students may not understand this concept, this wording. This is the abbreviation of purchasing power parity. To make it more simple comparison, for example, we call McBurger price or McDonald hamburger price PPP. That kind of some but funny concept existing. To explain PPP, purchasing power parity. Purchasing power parity is, for example, one McDonald hamburger in New York City, in Seoul City, in Tokyo City, in for example, Beijing, and in Moscow. I believe there is a McDonald's store in Moscow. Is it? Do you know? Have you visited the McDonald's hamburger store in Moscow? I
Yes,
believe there
there
is.
are many of them.
Oh,
Yes, there are McDonald's store in Moscow.
oh yeah. Okay. So what we say that we call McBurger index. That means, okay, suppose McDonald's hamburger in New York is selling $4 a piece. Then in Russia, so many rubles. Okay, in China, so many yen, and in Tokyo, so many yen, and in China, so many yuan, and in Korea, so many won. But each these currency is reflected its purchasing power in the price of McBurger. So in other words, purchasing power parity depends on price level of each nation. So this real dollar expression is also needs to be readjusted by purchasing power parity. In other words, relative price level. Okay. This US dollars in 1990 is real dollar, but it is only for between 2 years, like for example 1990 and 1991. Real dollars is in terms of only US real dollars, not in terms of 1990 US dollars with 1990 Russian rubles. No, that needs to be readjusted by purchasing power parity. So cross-country comparison can only be made realistically when we adjust relative price level by PPP. Okay, a little bit difficult concept for non-economics major students to understand, but roughly speaking, you can say that PPP is cross-country adjustment necessary. Real dollar is an inflation adjusting method. So two together can make real dollar comparison per capita GDP. So according to their estimate, uh, Japan around, for example, during this early period, uh, for example, 20th century early period, Japan estimate of Japan per capita GDP is roughly 2154 to over $2,000. So it was about double the Taiwanese per capita income, that almost double the Korea's per capita income, and even China's income roughly 4 times higher than China's average per capita income. So in other words, this shows relative well-being to some extent per capita income. And among East Asian nations, Japan was certainly a lot higher than the rest of East Asian nations. Okay. So the ensuing changes in the agriculture and industry, we will take a look at in the history of modern China. Significant changes in agriculture and industry did not bring about modern economic growth. We want to identify the crucial factors behind the slower progress of China rather than Japan, right? Economic growth pattern in the Maoist period and twin goals under Mao Zedong, rapid industrialization and socialization, ultimately fails. In other words, for rapid industrialization, socialization was not enough. For socialization, rapid industrialization was not enough. So rapid industrialization and socialization were not compatible goals under Mao Zedong. So that's why China under Mao Zedong did not move on, did not develop itself that much. The Soviet model at the beginning was taken up by China because Soviet Union model was the only available modern economic growth model. So they carried out the great leap forward movement during late 1950s and followed up by Cultural Revolution 1966, 1976. And that was basically radical variant of the Soviet model to root out a new bourgeois class, to establish a more egalitarian, non-elitist and participatory type of socialism. New data discredit this view, and the Maoist model is just a figment of their imagination, which was never realized. So, toward more genuine socialist society, Cultural Revolution aimed at. But this consequence of Cultural Revolution was devastating failure. You can see here Mao, and here Yu Shaoqi and all the staffs of Mao's staff. This is the kind of students' riot to topple symbolic sort of gates. And this is in the middle of a Cultural Revolution. And the Soviet approach was taken up by modern China to resemble Soviet development, but Maoist strategy was failed in light of the Great Famine, Cultural Revolution, and their open door policy and reforms since 1979 ultimately could make correction to this failure under Mao. So only after 1979, China became the first communist country initiating transition from a planned economy to market economy. How China avoided short-run costs, China's reform strategy and results, the new growth strategy since reform, and comprehensive assessments on outcomes will be the main topic when we get into China session. Okay. Now we can move on to more Korea-focused period. So as we learned from last lecture, Korea was liberated from Japanese rule, colonial rule, 1945. A typical classical example of divergence of Western type economic and political development. Divergence means that Western type economic development was achieved, but Korea was basically under authoritarian regime, lagging behind political development. So divergence between economic and political development. This is a brief history of Korean liberation in 1945 and military government by United States occupied government run the country from 45 to 1948. But the North Korea was heavily industrialized part of the peninsula, and the southern part was divided as a consequence of World War II, as I outlined last time. Korean War, a quarter of wealth destroyed, and over 1 million people died, for example. From 1953 to 1962, just South Korean economy kept alive by the US military and economic assistance. Of course, after 1953, North Korea advanced further, at least trying to resemble Soviet economic development model, and they developed faster than South Korean economy during this, at least this early period. And as we learned, 70,000 Japanese administrators left 1945 to 1946, leaving the country in vacuum in terms of governorship. Government was not there. So as we learned the last time, Tri-Power Conference in Cairo suggested a trusteeship for Korea, but Korean people vehemently opposed to trusteeship. Therefore, the general election was held in the South, 1948. Syngman Rhee was elected first president. What happened after this 1953-1962 to South Korea? All of a sudden, South Korean economy became increasing at about 10% a year under Park regime. I explained why Park regime could be successful in terms of economic mobilization, economic development, because Park lacked legitimacy, becoming head of military government, kind of military group who staged coup d'etat, right? So, you have seen these days Myanmar case. This type of Myanmar type chaos was there in 1963 in the Korean Peninsula. Okay. US assistance phased out in 1975. The rapid growth, the social and economic modernization well underway. However, political development was not made much progress, moved in the opposite direction. Divergence, whereas we have seen divergence. This is the tri-party sort of negotiation and agreement in Cairo. This is Korean Minister Lee Dong-won and Japanese Foreign Minister Shina Etsusaburo signed the Treaty on Basic Relations, restoring the Republic of Korea and Japanese diplomatic relationship in 1965. Remember, 1945 was the year of liberation from Japanese colonial rule. So almost 20 years, there was no diplomatic relation between Japan and Korea. Okay. And if you look at briefly the history of economic growth, in Japan, in Korea, in particularly in South Korea, under President Lee regime and under President Park regime. You can see 1952 is 53 was the Korean War stopped. And then you have a kind of a history here. Hyundai Motor Company was founded. LG Electronics was founded. And demographic reforms, both Roh-tae-woo and elected president. And then this shows you Asian financial crisis in 1997, global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. So we call this is kind of miracle on the Han River. 70 years later, gross national income per capita has jumped all the way down. On the other hand, North Korea's per capita income remained very stagnant, as you can see in red line here. So the question is, why two divided nations, North Korea and South Korea, are so different in terms of economic development? That's the question we have to study throughout this semester. So Korea under authoritarian regime, briefly, we can sort of take a look at Korean War, communist institutions and practices gone after Korean War. And this part we already studied. Defeated Progressive Party presidential hopeful candidate by large margin. Ultimately, Mr. Cho Bong-am was executed in 1958. So basically, anti-communism regime was established. In 1960 election, Liberal Party was versus well-organized Democratic Party fought very aggressively. And the result, as a consequence of this result, Democratic Party claimed that election was stolen. There was a student revolt and riot in 1960, and President Lee resigned on April 27, followed by one-year democracy from July 29 election with Changmyon premier. But May 1961, military coup staged by President Park, like this picture. And in retrospect, we can say that under President Lee, Korean government was governed by personal authoritarian regime. On the other hand, Park was more relying on bureaucratic authoritarian regime, more organized fashion. Okay. So this is the kind of a very turbulent period in Korean history, April 2019 student uprising scene. This is President Park in the middle here, wearing sunglasses. He was the boss for the military coup. So this was Korea under AR, authoritarian regime. Military Council Chairman Park Chung-hee and Korean CIA Director Kim Jong-pil with some other 30 colonels and brigadier generals staged the coup. No organized opposition, but very little popular support. So economic growth was to be the chief factor that would legitimize the new government, which became one of the most centralized. So Democratic Republican Party, led by President Park, won the election in November 1963, controlling majority of the assembly seats. This is the thing you have to remember. First 5-year plan was launched for the years 1962-1966 with the stabilization programs of 1963-1966 and joint US-Korean Economic Cooperation Committee was established. So the key factor you have to remember is normalization of the diplomatic relation with Japan in late 1963. So Japanese reparations of $500 million was the key contributing factor to further inflow of private investment and technology from Japan. Ultimately, South Korean economy could be accelerated its economic growth already in motion. Okay. Similar patterns can be observed in many developing countries. Results of this structure often vary, though, from one country to another. Successful examples include Korea, Brazil, Taiwan, and so forth. But there are also failing examples in other parts of the world. While Western governments also increased their participation with the move towards social welfare, they did not have the issue of resource allocation, had enough time to implement a functioning system with checks and balances. But in many parts of Eastern governments in Asia, they did not have this ability of resource allocation. They did not have enough time to implement a functioning system. So another reason explaining this difference is that certain structural changes are hard to implement in a democratic environment. For example, how Korea could develop under authoritarian regime. Too much democracy, for example. Then there may not have been normalization of relations with Japan due to strong protest, domestic protest. They could not have, endured quadrupled gasoline price overnight in 1973. There could have been street riots, demonstrations because of quadrupled gasoline price. So military government, basically authoritarian regime, sort of suppressed any riot or demonstration. And if Korea was under full democracy, they could not have made normalization of relations with Japan. They could not have endured quadrupled gasoline price overnight in the year of 1973. So this is a kind of inevitable advantage of being in an authoritarian regime. The influence of military was formidable. And over 600,000 people are from every village, and over 200,000 people always returning to in the form of discharge. Over 2 million people aged between 18 and 40 are in the militia. So economic development with political stability of disciplined society could begin. In many parts of the third world, this type of military influence did not exist. So the civilian forces were very much diplomatic, were very much democratic, and there were lack of disciplined society. So mobilization of resources were not easy in those basically too much democratic society. After 1965, a unique relationship between government and business through economic planning board. We call this as elite authoritarian rule. In other words, government and business move together rather than separately. Business usually under the government influence, and government is kind of making elite authoritarian rule. So Korea under authoritarian regime in 1967 and presidential election, Park versus Yoon Po-sun, and construction first and distribution later was the claim by Park, but income equitable distribution, more equitable distribution of income and greater emphasis on social welfare was the opposition party's slogan. But Park made a landslide victory, dominating 110 seats out of 130 assembly seats. And ultimately, that led to plebiscite in 1970. And 3 terms Park promised if elected in 1970, but he would step down in 1975. But opposition party leader Kim Dae-jung carried Seoul but lost. Park wins 45%, a very narrow margin against Kim Dae-jung, who became later president after 1997 in South Korea. Okay. So this is the picture in 1972. Park regime proposed a new Yushin, kind of revitalizing reforms, leaving president's term at his discretion. The new constitution got 91% at a popular referendum. But developments in Vietnam War influenced. American support, political stability, economic growth followed. By 1975, plebiscites designed to reaffirm the legitimacy of the government. 50% voted and supported. 25% were negative. But substantial opposition remained in the cities, universities, other intellectual communities. So Korea under authoritarian regime, political developments in Korea have not moved in the direction of modernization, institutions, values, and structure of the West. Government has had a pervasive influence on the use of economic resources and the distribution of income, and the failure of democracy in Korea, even though the democratic political aspirations continued to exist. So this is the conclusion that I repeated in last lecture. Modernization in the third world has not led in the direction of political democracy, and Korea is no exception, meaning that Korea was making very fast economic development, but politically very late in modernization, in democratization. 1950 invasion from north and the possibility of renewed invasion from the north was a sufficient justification for fifth largest standing army. So they could not, South Korea could not give up army, existence of army, and US military assistance. Still, Japan and US served as basic sources of education. As Korea develops, the divergence between political development and current social change will become pronounced. Authoritarian regime in Korea differs from other LDC, less developed countries. Korea took economic growth as a national objective. On the other hand, other less developed countries not necessarily adopting economic growth as a unified national objective. Not only national income increased since 1963, remarkable, but also all elements of population have shared this prosperity. So the governing elite considered political stability to be essential to economic growth and repression of political opposition necessary. So Mason et al., since this was first written, dramatic events have overtaken Korea. The assassination of President Park by the head of Korean CIA on October 26, 1979, occurred. Western friends see an opportunity for the establishment of fundamentally democratic state. And as history turns out, this statement became true. Korea took another 20 years to fully democratize itself. Almost at the end of 1980s and early 1990s, Korea, in genuine sense, became a democratic state. The best that can be hoped for is a regime less repressive and far more decentralized, and probably move on to more fully pledged democracy. But given the continuing threat from the North Korea, any signs of indecision and weakness by a more democratic regime would elicit a demand for strong direction. So only if the posture of North changes due to internal developments or external pressures, it seems likely that democratization can be pursued in a more permissive and secure environment. So this completes the chapter 2, and chapter 3 is, please turn on to chapter 3. Okay. So chapter 3 is basically begins with the historical foundations of modern economic growth, basically centered upon Korea. There are 3 basic parts to Korea's historical foundations. Long time of independence as a single unified state, homogeneous independent state, over 1,200 years. One language, one race, and the single culture is a characteristic of Korean Peninsula. Korea was unified by its own Silla dynasty in the 7th century, different from countries formed by colonial powers and Spanish Portuguese colonialization. And Korea was inherited East Asian heritage, Confucianism, and emphasis on education. And Korea is known to have a very good advantage of Hangul phonetic system, and it improved upon literacy rates, which is a very unique feature of Korea's culture. peasant farmers achieving very high yields per unit of arable acreage. Of course, this is intensive farming, the result of intensive farming that I explained, right? Supporting aristocracy of landlords and officials, creating commercial supply networks. By 1910, Korea was formally annexed to Japanese Empire until 1945, end of Second World War II. Most Koreans suffered real deprivation under Japanese rule, but profound changes, including the Japanese mode of bureaucratic control of the economy, followed. So there are pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages, deprivation and to some extent improvement. So this is two edges of Japanese rule. On the one hand, it means deprivation. On the other hand, it means development. So February 1945, when casual Yalta Agreement, as we discussed last lecture, Soviet and American troops divide the acceptance of surrender of Japanese troops at the 38th parallel line. So the division of the nation into two parts occurred. A key feature of modern economic growth is a rise in per capita income. Don't forget that. How do you distinguish modern economic growth is feature? Or it must come by a rise in per capita income. Traditional or backward pre-modern societies, there was not much rise in per capita income. Very stagnant societies. Tokugawa Japan, which lasted almost like 300 years, political unification and rapid rise in commerce, urbanization, levels of literacies improved, agricultural productivity increased under Tokugawa Japan. Pre-modern China in 1,000 years ago, several over million cities and 1/3 of adult males were literate. So both Japan and China were pretty much developed. And over hundreds of thousands with over 20 and over year formal education and tutoring. So please look at table 3.1. And the 14th to 19th century population increased by 6-fold, were fed by grain output increase. So in these centuries, population itself was political, not only political power, but also population itself was economic power. Population itself was industry. Why? Because farming was dominant industry during this period. Almost no manufacturing, very little service sector. So in farming, population itself was a production power. And if the production power, population was not supported, was not maintained, was not fed by increased output of crops, then population will disappear. So economic power, the symbol of economic power was productive power, was population itself. So this is population growth in pre-modern East Asia. very important statistics. For example, Korea annual rise in population was very stagnant, almost near negative. Throughout the entire period of Lee dynasty, 500 years. Of course, these are estimates. Only increased after Japan consolidated power under colonial rule. During Japanese colonial period, population increased by 1.8%. How about China? Very healthy increase of population occurred during this period. Of course, their population growth rate was slower than Korea's population growth period during 1917-1949 period. Relatively lower population growth. This symbolizes why China's population growth rate was falling behind Japanese population growth rate 1.09%, 0.9%, because China was under internal war between Mao Group, Communist Party, and Chiang-led National Party. You remember? China was under internal war. So population growth could not be impressive. So these population statistics tells the real story, real history. So you have to pay for attention. Look at this. Prior 1872, 1930, China and Japan grew, its population growth was very similar, around 0.3%. Very healthy, steady population growth. But Korea was very stagnant. That means Korea's production ability, farm production ability, could not match up China or Japan. So continuous failure of farm production increase due to very difficult harvest, a lot of economic hardship, famine, population was not supported, so relatively very stagnant society. Korea was falling behind China and Japan. And later, China was falling behind Japan. So these population growth statistics are very important to understand East Asian development. Okay. For example, these two charts are showing that for example, Japan in late 19th century and China after 1949 adopted universal primary education. Everyone was allowed to enter primary education. Technical training for the operation of modern industry and controlled their domestic commerce comparison with Southeast Asia and Africa. So government institutions and political affairs grounded on their political realities. Korea was a part of Greater East Asian experience, but with significant changes, for example. Korea under 13th century was invaded by Mongol. 14th century to 1910, Lee dynasty governed this country. 1590s invasion by the Japanese under Hideyoshi. Korea's pre-modern population growth rate was less than 0.5% per year. And if you see table 1 and table 2 from 14th century to 1910, Korea's population increased by 7 to 8 times, but the area of arable land increased by twofold or less. So land increase was not catching up population increase. Therefore, Korean farm production failed to increase. 1918, the first Japanese land survey was conducted under Japanese colonial government. Koreans on the average had only about 0.12 hectare. So it's about 1/3 acre. Only Japan had less cultivated acreage per capita. Please remember this. Japan was even less equipped with cultivated acreage per capita. So both Japan and Korea, of course, was very low in terms of land per family or per capita. Therefore, Korea and Japan had to engage themselves in very much intensive farming, right? As I described before. This is the population statistic I referred to. This is a population growth in Korea, which we refer to. And look at this is another very interesting statistic. Urbanization. Let me take a look at, for example, over 100,000 people living cities, okay? And in case of Korea, only 2% of total population lived in over 10,000, over 100,000 big city. How about China? Around similar time period, 3.4%. How about Japan? 유진아, 이게 조금 더 내려 볼 수가 있지. 이거 어떻게 해야 돼? 안 돼? Okay, it looks like this is all right. Early 19th century, over 6% of total population lived in big city in Japan. So that much Japan was ahead of time, ahead of urbanization. So Japan was more commercialized, commercially developed. Therefore, more rapid urbanization was occurring, followed by China, and least followed by Korea. Okay, so this is another interesting statistic for you to take a look at. The economic and social structure of traditional Korea and exploitive Japanese occupation also laid the groundwork of industry. Industrial experience and increase in labor force occurred. Of course, Japan expanded educational system. And I hope we can take a look at this education as a separate issue in later chapters. However, rural areas became poorer. More landlords, less Koreans that owned the farms they worked in. Limited land endowment, therefore relatively high crop yield per hectare. After 1600, rice transplanting was introduced. Rice transplanting means at the beginning, you see the rice on the kind of paddy field, Then you move the grown rice plant into different dry field. We call that as transplanting. And double cropping of rice and barley in the south. If the weather is good in the south, warm, in the winter they grow barley, in the summer they grow rice. We call that as double cropping. 14th century, cotton was introduced. It did not reach until 16th century in Japan. So cotton introduced to Korean Peninsula later was transplanted into Japan. European discovery of America, as a consequence of European discovery of America, tobacco and sweet potato crops with gradual irrigation system was adopted. So Korea by early 20th century, a complex advanced agricultural technology was introduced. By the latter part of Yi Dynasty, Korea had acquired a land tenure system, and the modern rural labor force was largely free. So in other words, land tenure system means there is a landlord and also peasant groups who cultivate the land, all right? So this land tenure system was the characteristic of many parts of Korean farming societies. Three classes were in Korea. The aristocracy was so-called Yangban class, commoners, ordinary people, and low-born, mainly serfs or slaves, lower born or low-born people, lower groups, social status group. Relative restriction to the entrance into the aristocracy. In other words, from commoners become the aristocracy or Yangban class. Japan was the most restrictive society. This is a very interesting observation, historical fact. I always like to quote. You see, in Japan, the commoners were almost impossible to become aristocrats. We call this Japanese aristocracy busha, or this aristocracy, Japanese style. Shogun and his associates. But in Japan, commoners becoming aristocracy almost impossible. Korea, next highest difficult society for commoners to become aristocracy. But China was a lot less restrictive. Isn't it interesting to observe that? So in China, social mobility was a lot larger than Korea, of course, a lot larger than Japan. Okay, so this is very interesting. In China, in principle, everyone who passed 3-degree examinations were allowed to reach highest bureaucracy. In Korea, only Yangban by birth could take the exams. But mobility between two lower classes were very low, for example. Okay. Two social trends in Lee Dynasty we should observe. Gradual decline in size of the slave class and consolidation of private ownership of land, which is bought and sold freely but highly concentrated in the hands of few well-to-do families. So this is the difference from China. According to Japanese land survey in the 1910s, after being colonialized by Japan, 40% rented all the land cultivated. 20% owned all the land they tilled. So only 20% owned all the land they tilled. The rest basically rented land. Kings in late Li dynasty were hemmed in by a powerful bureaucracy. This is a very interesting observation. A second force limiting Korean absolutism, weak financial position of the government. Only 20%, 30% of local production made to Seoul. Percentage of estimates of GDP at the disposal of government. Korea under 2%, China under 2%, Tokugawa Japan under 25%, and 12% of early Meiji Japan. What does these statistics imply? That means Korea and China had very little central government power. On the other hand, Tokugawa Japan and Meiji Japan had very forceful central government's power. Okay, so this shows that in relative terms, Japan's central government had much more powerful kind of economic power. On the other hand, China and Korea had a very little economic power by the central government. East Asian cities, not commerce center as in Europe. In Europe, for example, Hamburg and Amsterdam were commercial centers. But in East Asian cities, these main cities became sort of center of government. For example, Qingdao, China, over 1 million people cities were all government cities. Tokugawa, Japan, numerous military samurai class in the cities. Seoul, about 200,000 people until the early 20th century. See table 3, Korea's population about 1/3 of Japan and 1/13 of China. So in terms of pure population size, Korea's power was about 1/3 of Japan, 1/13 of China. Relatively small country Korea was. Economic and social structure of traditional Korea, continuing, a substantial urban population became commercial network. Fifth-day periodic markets with peddlers in villages and settled merchants in larger towns with administrative centers. Fifth-day periodic market means every fifth day, local periodic markets were opened with peddlers in villages, settled merchants in larger towns with administrative centers. In 14th, in 17th and 18th century, expansion of private commerce occurred. Until 17th century, cloth and grain as substitutes for money. Late 17th and early 18th century, copper coinage established, circulated mostly in cities, and decline of government handicrafts. So foreign trade was a government's monopoly at the time. Embassies were sent by Korea to China and received by Korean from Japan. So Japan sent their embassies to Korea. Korea sent their embassies to China. Okay. Okay, maybe even though it is in the middle of the chapter 3, we must stop here, and I will be happy to continue starting from this slide next class. And I would like to receive your comments or your questions for the next roughly 15 minutes, if possible. Okay. Eugene, make a note of it, right?
Thank you for such comprehensive lecture. My name is Evgeny Tищенко. I'm a PhD student from Irkutsk and have some accommodation with Eurasian Economic Club of Scientists in Kazakhstan. I have such a question. Have you, how can you assess chaebol dissemination as a factor of Korean economy modernization in 70s, 80s? Thanks.
Korean economy's modernization in 17th and 18th century was not becoming a reality. 17th and 18th century, Korea was a relatively backward nation, very stagnant, as I explained. First, the stagnancy came from population increased very rapidly, but cultivated land did not increase that much. So that means per hectare, per piece of land, output was declining and could not support population. So modernization could not be developed during 17th, 18th century under Yi dynasty. And that's why Korea became very stagnant, falling behind Japan, Tokugawa period, or China on the Ming and Qing period. Relatively, Korea's development was falling behind. Evgeny, that's my answer.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah. Any other question? And of course, you may have some other questions, but not in time. Please do not hesitate any moment. Send me directly my email number, your question. I will try to answer in writing. Okay, that's the way we communicate in this online lecture.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is Olga. Yes, Amosova.
Yeah, Amosova. How do you pronounce your first name? Amosova?
Amosova.
Yeah. Where are you based? Are you in Tomsk or Irkutsk?
In Irkutsk.
Irkutsk.
Yes, from
Okay.
Irkutsk.
Okay.
So I have a question. You have told us that in China, anyone who passed some kind of 3-degree examination were allowed to reach highest class. Yes.
Right.
And I have a question about this examination. What kind of this it was?
Yeah,
I don't really understand.
Yeah, I should say that examination is kind of entrance examination for bureaucracy. If you want to become government employee, you need to pass the exam. And it seems like China used to have 3-degree exams, maybe highest degree exam for really high professional bureaucrat, 2nd degree, maybe common bureaucrats, 3rd degree, maybe lower bureaucrats. But relatively, China was maintaining very open system. Everyone can take the exam and promote himself or herself toward upper social status. But Japan did not allow even commoners to take those exams. Japan maintained high top aristocracy near shogunate system, and they had a samurai class, and samurais could not, you cannot become samurai just because by taking exam. So what we call upward social mobility. In other words, from lower social class to upward mobility was prohibited in Japan. But relatively speaking, China was freer. China with more freedom of social status, upward mobility. Always you find Korean case is in between. Whatever, Korean food is in terms of style. I believe some of you have tasted Korean food. It's
Yes,
less drier than Japanese, but
yes,
it is also less greasier than Chinese. So, Korean destiny is always in between, squeezed between China, powerful China, and Japan. Political system and everything, almost everything becomes squeezed, mixed fashion to some extent. Amasova, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I ask, such examination, can we call a meritocracy system?
What kind of system?
Meritocracy.
Yeah, meritocracy. Yes, we could.
Yes.
We could call that kind of system merit. In other words, kind of merit-based system. It's not by family connection. Okay, it is not by favoritism. Meritocracy means it is more merit-based. If you are becoming extraordinarily literate people, if you are a very literate person, you can pass the exam. Yes, more merit-based system. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, then I don't know whether you know the calendar system in Korea and in China, not necessarily in Japan. Both China and Korea are maintaining lunar calendar system, by which I mean tomorrow and the day after tomorrow we have New Year's festivity. Due to coronavirus infection, COVID-19, we don't have that much festivity here. But lunar calendar starts from the day after tomorrow here, also in Japan, in China. I heard even in China, there is partial lockdown. Chinese government are not encouraging people to pay their visit to hometown. The same is true with Korean government. They are not asking for grouping more than 5 people. They are trying to prohibit, family gathering over 5 people. So the general sort of atmosphere here in Seoul is really calmed down. It's not really bright. It is kind of gloomy. So this is the first year we are entering into lunar calendar, Happy New Year, without that much happiness. Okay. In Russia, of course, your New Year already begun. There is no lunar calendar. But China and China and Korea only. Japan is not observing lunar calendar. Isn't it interesting too? I think it is also interesting phenomena. Why Korea follows Chinese tradition rather than Japanese tradition? That's another question that I want to impose upon you. Okay, so let us see with each other next week, next Wednesday, and to open my 4th lecture. Okay. In between, please read the textbook up until chapter 3 and additional reading chapter 4 if you have time. Thank you very much. 나가자.
채팅으로 학생
That's very nice. 내가 리턴을 하려면 어떻게 되지? 채팅으로 들어가야 되나?
그냥 여기 타이핑하시면 돼요.
Diana, I like your remark, Korean remark. Very nice. Thank you.